Hello, one and all. I am Blue Penguin, or Azure, and for today's video, I am going to go over five things that I learned over the course of my semester under Professor Christopher Collins in History 235, which is History of Ethnic Groups in the U.S. Professor Collins came in after Popel left on family leave, so today I'm going to be going over five things that I learned over the course of the semester that stuck out to me the most as part of something known as a celebration of knowledge, which is going to be our final, basically. So let's just jump into it. First and foremost, I wanted to talk about something known as the Cycle of Socialization. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically just a large cycle type idea that revolves around the idea that we are all socially conditioned from birth to believe certain things, such as the ideas of race, class, gender, likewise. Whether you're looking at stuff from the macro levels, which deals with race, gender, all that, meso, which is more about the communities you belong to, whether in school or otherwise, and micro, or basically just personal things about yourself, like your personality, style, clothing, what have you. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of that is just the fact that this cycle of socialization is still carrying on, because socialization starts before we're even born. That's kind of the first step in this cycle. Is just like from birth, like during our time in the womb and during our time after that, we are socially conditioned. We are, after we're born, we're raised to believe that, we're given our macro level identities based on our parents, based on what we believe in, based on, all these different things. So it's complex. It's very complex in that way. So, with all that said, the cycle of socialization is very complex in that regard because of that. So, of course, you have the beginning where you're just growing up. You're just learning about what the world is around you. You're learning about who you are as a person, who you belong to in your communities. If you belong to communities, you're learning about where you belong in terms of your macro identities, like where you identify in terms of your race, in terms of your ethnic identity, in terms of your gender, in terms of your class, even in terms of your religion. That's a macro identity in and of itself. And that's pretty huge in terms of that. So, with all that said in mind, the next part of the cycle is what's known as institutional and cultural socialization. Now, institutional socialization is where we are conditioned to understand the world around us through the institutions we enter as we get older, such as schools or workplaces, or wherever else we land. We are being socially conditioned within these institutions to understand where we are in our meso identities. Meso meaning like the middle ground. What essentially I mean by that is that meso identities are like our communities, like geeks, jocks, the popular people, the nerds, all of that. That's all part of this meso identity, among other related stuff like that. But when you think, the way I look at it is if you're looking at it through the meso, what I think of it as is just like the communities you belong to, where you belong in terms of community, like who you belong to, and what you think of the other persons in that community as well as those around you in other communities. And then cultural socialization, that's a bit different because that is more towards what we consume in the media. So that means stuff like TV, movies, plays, especially in the Greek era, like in Medea. That was very like culturally significant because that talked about like an early version of Hansel and Gretel. I could talk about that for hours, but that's for another video if you want that. Um, let me know down in the comments if you like want a video talking about Medea. If you want that, just for me to talk about Medea as a play, what it stood for, how it works, what it like really means, and just if you want me to do that, let me know, and I can certainly give that a shot when I get the chance, probably after finals. But that's for another story. That's for another video. And then after that, after like we're all growing up and everything, then here's where we get into something called enforcement. This is where you get into the idea of reaping what you sow. Essentially, if you reap, if you do good in society's eyes, you get rewards. And for most white, middle class, heterosexual males, that's the case. Because that's how the system is designed in various ways. And so with all that we just mentioned from before, these macro identities, such as race, religion, sex, gender identity, what have you, those all decide for you what you're going to get. Especially if you're African American, you get the short end of the stick. And in society's eyes, you're fucked. Because no one wants to do anything. Because they think that, according to them, we have something called cultural imperialism that's happening. Cultural imperialism being this idea of wanting to... This idea of having one culture be dominant over another. And so, and what especially applied to the context of European Americans, we've like really made ourselves the dominant culture. And so when you're talking about cultures like those of African Americans, Asian Americans, Irish Americans, what have you, we've just dominated that from like all aspects. Like heterosexuality is the norm, whiteness is the norm, being male is the norm, being middle class or high class, that's the norm. And anyone that's below that, or anyone that's like successful, but they're not this, or this, that's not good to them. That's not what they want for themselves, because they don't want to lose that power that they have over everyone else. And that's why they're so concerned about talking about this, because they don't want those in power to understand what's going on and want us to break the cycle. Is this kind of glares into the next thing I want to talk about, which I learned about in the immigration unit of this class, what's known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is one of several signed into law acts that were developed by the U.S. to exclude Chinese Americans, especially here in California. So what that did was that the Exclusion Act basically gave America, and especially California, the right to exclude Chinese Americans from certain things. It was kind of like Jim Crow, or any of the other like Reconstruction era acts, or any of the other modern acts or laws that have been signed in that gives America the legal right to segregate and discriminate. It's similar to that in that the Chinese Exclusion Act gave America and California the right to... when I'm talking about California, I'm talking about it as the state. America, and especially California, it gave them the right to be able to exclude them from certain things, like marrying, running for office. It's the same like us versus them mentality that like we've been talking about for so long. Especially when we're talking about history, we've been talking about this us versus them mentality for a long time. And that's really concerning, because when you're talking about this kind of thing, this, immigration, or just about, not about immigration, just talking about like in general, immigration, it's just this entire thing of, just wanting to, just make sure that it's all about power. That's what it all is. It's just all about power. It's all about the want to have control. The want to have control over everything. That's kind of what these acts are all about. It's just about control, keeping power, keeping control over the lower classes that you deem lower, and making sure that you remain dominant. That's what this is all about. And speaking of which, speaking on immigration, the next thing I want to talk about was how the immigration system impacted Mexican immigration. So I wrote a paper on this a while back, and I did have some really good sources here, like from the Migration Policy Institute, Time Magazine, and the CATO Institute, which are all people that talk about immigration. So one of the things I want to talk about with this is just the fact that a lot of the immigration that takes place in the U.S. is mainly about, agriculture or about work. That's what Mexican immigration was mainly about. There was also that time during the Colombian Wars or during the Mexican Civil Wars or what have you, when more Mexican immigrants migrated here for that, because immigration is definitely one of those things where it's you get away from a situation, and one of the most common is war. This is one of those situations where that's true. So with all that said, of course, there is this idea that when Mexican immigrants migrated here, one of the main things that people talk about is just the fact that, oh, Mexicans are taking our jobs, or that the fact that they're taking American jobs and all of that. It's just the main argument against that sentiment is just that the jobs that Mexican immigrants take are not ones that we would do ourselves. Unless we were raised in the South, we would never be able to do the jobs that Mexican immigrants have done for years, like in the mining industry, in agriculture, in all these different industries that we ourselves would never dream of doing. It's just this entire thing of just making sure that that we recognize that it's not about whether or not they took the jobs, because they didn't take them because no one was doing them. It's a matter of just recognizing what they've done and just making sure that we know that they've done so much for us. And immigration has really pushed America's industries so far. Not a lot of people really talk about that. So that's really important to discuss when you're talking about immigration, is that immigration has really taken us far, and it's really made us a powerhouse, especially when you're talking about industry. One thing that I mentioned in this paper was about a ghost story that is often a part of Mexican American culture, a big part of Latinx culture. Very, 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 very important to talk about this when you're discussing in any capacity, any part of Mexican American history. You want to talk about Lyrona a little bit. Now, if you guys don't know who Lyrona is, she is a part of a ghost story. Lyrona translates to the weeping widow, or the weeping woman, however you translate. Regardless, Lyrona is a story of a woman named Maria, who drowns her kids in the nearby river after finding out about her husband's infidelity. With that said, Lyrona according to me and other people. Her story has really shifted to this cultural icon type story where this you're talking about a parenting tool first and foremost. Because that's what Lyrona has been used for more often than not is as a parenting tool, especially in its early history. When you're talking about Torio Grande and not going there in the night because you don't want to be stolen by Lyrona, because she's gonna try to drown you and take you as her own. That's kind of her whole shtick, is that like because her kids drowned, they were washed down the river, or their souls were. So she has to find them. And so if she sees kids walking down the river, she may think that they are hers. So that's kind of what that means by it being a parenting tool. But also, in more recent years, it's become this more of a social and cultural icon, especially when you're talking about Chicano literature, or you're talking about early Grimm stories or other related stuff like that, even dating back to pre-Hispanic history, like with the story of La Malinche, or the story of Hernan Cortez's translator and concubine. And this kind of leads to the main point of like what like of Lyrona's significance, in that it really takes on more of a cultural significance by really betraying one's culture by questioning and breaking classic cultural gender and class roles and hierarchies in society. And it's really evolved to that over the course of years and years and years. Especially if you look at early Chicano literature and you look at all these different things where it's just like you have all of these like things you can talk about in terms of like what you want to talk about with La Llorona. Especially if you look at stories from Domino Rennie Perez, or even if you look at the show Grimm. That has pretty good representation of La Llorona, among other related stuff like that. So, very interesting stuff when you talk about that kind of stuff. And then another thing I wanted to talk about was an academic journal article that I reviewed a while back, called "The Killer Behind the Badge: Race and Police Homicide in New Orleans, 1925 to 1945." This is a paper that we reviewed a while back, where it talks about the idea of police homicide, police brutality, especially towards African Americans during that time period. The main thing that I discussed in this paper was just that, or just the review of it, it was just mainly just talking about, just that like cops are not innocent. This article analyzed the homicide records in New Orleans, and shockingly enough, 14 years between 1925 and 1945 have like accurate records that have been kept of police homicide. Several of which were African American, a few were white, mainly because of crime control, but mostly it was African Americans because they acted suspicious. So cops really haven't changed between then and now. One thing I find interesting about this article is just that, this entire thing of police brutality being like a thing that's existed for years. And you don't really think about it until you read it yourself. Like, you really don't think about, how brutal police used to be back in like the 30s and 40s and even the late 20s. And you can even look back to the 1860s and even before then, where you had these slave patrols that did similar things. Like, they rounded up slave escapees, they brought them back, they brutalized those slaves. They really abused their power. And that's kind of what's happening now with police in modern day. They abuse their power. They really militarize themselves, make themselves look tough. They claim innocence constantly. They tamper with evidence. They harass African Americans on a consistent and constant basis. among other races, but especially African Americans. And you really notice that when you look at these old records and you look at all this different stuff about police history, and you really see that police are really like racist to their core and are really just, they are really, really like brutal towards those they deem unworthy of the benefits of society. So speaking of that, the last thing I wanted to talk about was something known as Carlisle School. This I learned in the education module. This is a school that had appeared when we Americans started with stuff like the Homestead Act and other related laws and acts that took place that allowed for the legal discrimination and oppression of Native American peoples here in the U.S. The Carlisle School was basically a Reformation school, but instead of something like in 1984, where you'd have the book, where it's like you're retrained, Native American children were taken away from their parents, and then reformed in these schools, reformed to be American children, as they called it. And so schools like these really just started popping up more and more. But especially the Carlisle School was most like awful because they really like pushed for American values. Like the Carlisle School, it really like stripped Native American children of their identity. They prohibited those children from speaking their native tongue. They only taught them in English and taught them English. Taught them to read, write, speak, and understand English. Taught them English math. Taught them English values. Taught them Christian values. Converted them. All that jazz. And it really, really just pushed for this idea of wanting to really change those children, really wanting to change the way they functioned. They wanted to change that mentality in the truest sense of the form, the truest sense of the matter. And that's sickening because, especially back then, when we really started to push for discrimination and we really started to push for all that, it's sickening because you don't really think about it until you read about it. And it's sickening because those children deserved a good life. Those children deserved a happy life, but they never got it because people like us were really pushing for this idea of wanting to make their life a living hell and wanting to integrate them into American society because we deemed it a responsibility for ourselves to push for that. Especially if you look at poems like The White Man's Burden, that really talks about how European Americans really felt pity for African tribes and about the African peoples that were being brought over here. They said that, especially in that poem, that like they felt it necessary to tame the savages, as they call them, and it's just really sickening to think about because, especially if you really, really want to like talk about segregation, not segregation. If you really want to talk about discrimination and oppression at that form, it's really all about wanting to integrate them into our society and making them part of us and pushing for their being a part of who we are and wanting them to be part of us. And if they don't want to do that, then, well, they can just fuck off, according to us, because we don't care. And that's really sickening because that shouldn't be the case, but it is. And it's awful because they deserve a good life. They deserve the want to have a better life than they deserve now, and that's why I took this class, especially not just because it was required for my units, but also because it really taught me something. It really taught me about just the entire idea of the system It really pushed that idea that we're all living in the system. We're all living in this horrible system that oppresses anything that's not white, male, middle or high class, heterosexual, what have you. It's really pushing for that. And I hope that in the future we can start talking about this more and open up a dialogue so that we can truly, deal with these issues once and for all and really be able to break the system, break the wheel, as Princess Targaryen, my bad, Daenerys Targaryen says in Game of Thrones. Sorry, I've never really watched it, but I know the quote. I know the quote, but I just never watched the series. Sue me. So anywho, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you liked it, please be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell if you wish to be sure to post more videos in the future when I have time. Again, if you guys want me to discuss Medea a bit more in depth and just talk about Medea itself, like why it's important to understand it, what it means, so on and so forth, please comment down below if you want that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.